I really find the creative process to be endlessly intriguing. What really drives an artist to create? There have been a number of very strong influences that have permeated my own work over the years and have continued to resurface. The architectural references are perhaps the most obvious, but they've really been tempered with the strange and curious qualities of light, depth, and illusion. Another important aspect of my creative process are the extremely strong influences of the objects that I collect and surround myself with. I have always been a collector. I've been a collector and an accumulator ever since I was a very small child. I started out with milk bottle caps and baseball cards and moths and butterflies and stamps and coins, and as the years went by, I moved on into Hawaiian shirts and 40s and 50s advertising pieces, French posters, salt and pepper shakers, ceramics, anything that I found visually interesting. I guess I've been accused of being a pack rat. I don't know that that's really necessarily the term I would use. I think I'm kind of a consummate accumulator. I love to surround myself with visually interesting objects. I think that all artists by nature are visual creatures, and if you visit artist studios or their lofts or wherever they live, you're going to find them very visually interesting, because I think artists in general really feed from that kind of visual activity. I know that's one of the reasons that I surround myself with these things, is that I find them stimulating. It isn't necessarily that there's a direct correlation between salt and pepper shakers or African masks or Art Deco cases and the art that I make, but there's certainly influences that are derived from it over the years. At one point I had 11 cars. Most of them were late 50s cruisers, a lot of Cadillacs. Of course, the 1959 Cadillac with the big 2-foot-tall double bullet tail fins that look like rocket ships. I've, for years, also owned classic boats. There just seems to be a romance and an ambiance in the old wooden boats that's just really never been duplicated. The boat that I currently have, I've had for about 8 years, is really a remarkable vessel. It was custom built in 1957 for a marine dealer in Portland, Oregon. It was built by Stevens Brothers. They're quite renowned for their craftsmanship and quality down in Stockton, California. I'm only the 4th owner of the boat. It's been pretty meticulously maintained, and we spend a lot of time and energy keeping it in show condition, or as close to that as possible. Zanzibar for me is really a total escape mechanism. It's a way for me to get completely away from reality, away from the studio, away from the office. I've owned and have rehabbed quite a few buildings in Seattle. The largest is the old Bemis Brothers bag building, which is where my loft is located. It's really a remarkable building as well, because it's filled with 12 to 17 foot ceilings and skylights, and all of the floors, and the majority of it, are 4.5 inch thick tongue and groove old growth fir with 1 inch maple over the top. So it's kind of an extraordinary piece of property. We were able to convert the top 2 floors to artist live work lofts, so we have an artist community on the top floors of the building. I've been particularly fascinated by the period from the mid-1920s, early 1920s really, up into the late 1940s, a very interesting stylistic period in history. The Art Deco period, of course, ran up until about 1930, and then the so-called Stil Modern, or the streamlined style of the 30s, was really kind of an offshoot of Art Deco, but all of the work that was really produced during that time, sculpturally and in terms of the decorative arts, really had a lot of traits that have influenced me, but really fascinated me. In the early 1970s, I really became interested in collecting antique glass. I bought a lot of glass for Harvey Littleton in the early and mid-70s, and as I could afford it, I kept more and more of the higher quality pieces for myself. The whole concept of light projection and shadow and illusion and mystery has been a very important aspect of my work for the last 25 years. In 1977, I went over to Europe on a Fulbright and worked with the J&L Lobmeyer factory in Vienna. That was a very interesting period of time for me creatively. I did not have the technical resources to create the types of sculpture that I had been doing, but it allowed me a period of time to concentrate on a series of blown glass pieces called the fantasy vessels. And these were very large, thick, massive pieces of blown glass, often 2.5 to 3 inches thick, with multiple layers. There was an abstract landscape design on the interior of the piece and figures that floated around the exterior of that. As the viewer moved around the piece, the figures would cast shadows back onto the landscape, creating this illusion of movement and depth within the piece itself. And this is really something that's still very important to me, and something that's been a big part of the current sculpture that I've been working on. This whole process of integrating the light projection into the sculpture really reached its peak in the 1980s with the Leitungscherben series. In these sculptures, the shadow projection was an integral part of the piece, and it was a very detailed color pattern that was projected onto the surface beneath the sculpture. I came to glass from an architectural background. Ever since I was a very small child, I always wanted to be an architect, and you can still see those influences in my sculpture. They're very much there today. It's a big part of what I do, is conceptualizing these spatial relationships. We start out with blocks of glass that are cast in billets for the optics industry. These typically weigh anywhere from 35 to 80 pounds. We get them from a variety of sources. Occasionally we are able to obtain glass from Corning in New York. We also get pallets of material from Taiwan and from Schott Optical in Pennsylvania and in Germany. The process then continues with the fractures. To fracture the glass, I use a whole series of tungsten carbide chisels. These are specially made, and they have very hard tungsten carbide inserts. The chisels that I use range anywhere from 1/8 of an inch wide up to the largest are 3 to 4 inches wide, with tungsten carbide blade inserts. These chisels were originally made for quarry tools and were designed to go into the ends of jackhammers. We had them specially fabricated without the additional fittings on them. I also use a wide range of hammers, different sizes of hammers, depending on the types of chisels that I'm using and the amount of material that I want to remove from the glass. Smaller weight hammers all the way up to 8 to 10 pound post mauls, which come in handy. To fracture through an 8 to 10 inch thick piece of glass, for example, this 3-inch chisel works quite nicely utilizing an 8-pound post maul. But of course, the blow has to be done correctly. You're going to end up with a big mess. After the pieces are fractured, we use a series of large diamond saws, 24 and 30-inch diameter diamond saws, to cut the large blocks down into trapezoidal forms. This gives me the stance that I want and allows me to select a particular direction that I'm going to go in with the piece. The two primary types of colored sheet glass that we use are vitrolite and Carrara. Vitrolite was made by Libby Owens Ford from the late 1920s, early 30s, up until about 1954. It was a trade name, and it was a commercially produced, optically polished glass that was initially made as a substitute, an inexpensive substitute originally for marble and granite and other stones on architectural building facings. You can still see some of it around on 1930s to 50s civic buildings and theaters and occasionally bar and restaurant buildings. The material was originally produced in large sheets. Some of the vitrolite was produced in sheets as wide as 12 by 10 feet. Occasionally I will use this grid glass that was produced by the Corning factory back in the 1930s. It was originally made as diffusing screens for fluorescent lights, and very shortly thereafter plastics were introduced and became available commercially, and this glass had a very short lifespan in terms of usability, so tons of it were literally put into landfills. There's not much of it around. So when I'm ready to use the glass, what we do is we take the sheets and cut them down into thinner strips. This is either done by hand using traditional glass cutters, or occasionally we'll use diamond saws depending on the type of glass, how difficult it is to cut, and the thickness of it. What's interesting about the work that I'm doing now is the sculptures really are almost like history lessons. They have often as many as 12 to 15 different types of glass in each piece. And the various colors were produced at different times over an 80-year period. The most complex part of the sculpture is fabricating the top color panels. The pieces often take 3 to 4 months to put together, and the color panels are really the most intensive part of that process. Mike Barrett really deserves a lot of credit for his part in this entire process. Mike's been working for me for 11 years, and he's been my studio manager for 6 years, and he's really a very talented individual. To watch this point right here. Other than that, I think we're doing pretty well with it. It takes a certain mentality to do cold working and to work through this entire process and the technical complexity of it. We definitely can't lose that point. So what we should probably do before these two pieces are laminated together is to grind this block down just a bit so we have a better idea of where that corner is going to be. Everything that we do is pretty much been developed by seat of the pants over a long period of time. We're fighting a double battle here because we've got to keep these points and then watch out for this low spot. I've always had a very intense interest in primitive art and ritual and religion and primitive cultures. That's not something that's innately obvious in the sculpture that I make, but yet it does come through on the level, particularly in the newer pieces, of creating this mystical light illusion in the center of the pieces. It's kind of almost spiritual space at the heart of the sculpture that's surrounded by this hard edge, high-tech surface. Probably a shy eighth of an inch left, but the clearance there is going to be... The light rays pass through the color panels and keep going directly through the optical glass until something stops them. What stops the light rays are the little fissures and the fractures at the base of the sculpture. Finish, you're going to have less than 3/4 of an inch. Okay, if this one's a little narrower than the other one. The light also passes completely through the cut lenses, but the lenses reflect and refract the patterns on the undersides of the color panels. So what that creates in the lower section within the interior of the sculpture are two color variations. You have the direct projections into the fissures and the fractures, which create these very watercolor-like mutations, and then you have this slightly more hard-edged distortion of the geometry on the undersides of the panel. So you look here where these yellows are. I don't want to shift its center lines about here. You might shift it slightly this way to take advantage of some more of those ambers. Colors up there. This one I've got directly under the Asahi opal, which gives that golden amber color when the light's projected through it. What I'm interested in here is projecting the colors from this particular combination set that I have here, most of which are transparent or translucent, projecting those colors down around the lens that we're going to cut into the corner. This particular piece is going to stay square, and it's going to have very big, deep lenses cut into each corner, and then a large lens cut into the center of it. So all of the patterning that you see at the top is going to project down into that large spherical circular lens cut at the base, and then the corners, these two opposite corners, are going to have this striped effect projected down over them. I use these strips much like a painter would use tubes of paint. I've been using the various colors for so long that I know exactly what will happen when I juxtapose one color next to another, a transparent color next to a translucent color, and what type of light projection or quality of light I'm going to achieve by placing those colors next to each other. I know what's going to happen when I put a copper blue next to a neodymium with a thin piece of crystal through it at roughly a certain angle. It's going to give me a certain type of colored light projected down into the lower section of the sculpture. The piece is always mutating as it goes along. I mean, if I had to do it all from a blueprint, I'd get so bored I'd never finish it. Pieces are machined by hand on large grinding wheels. These wheels are fed with a slurry of silicon carbide and water. We use different grits of silicon carbide, ranging from 60 grit all the way down to 600 mesh. And what that does is puts a very fine machine finish surface onto the pieces and allows us to go on to the next stage. After the strips are cut down into smaller sections, they're laminated into smaller components. These components are then cut and remachined on the diamond saws. Additional pieces of glass are added, so it becomes a process of cutting, fabricating, relaminating, recutting, relaminating, and the designs are gradually expanded and the panels start to reach their size for the selected piece. When I first started working with the light projection and the shadows back in the late 70s and early 80s, I would lay the patterns out on a light table and light them from below, so I had a really exact idea of what they were going to produce. It becomes kind of a tag team working with my assistants in the studio, where I'll come in and I'll lay out a certain section and mark it. They'll then do the fine grinding and laminate it, bring it back to me. I'll recut it, remark it, redesign it, get it back to them, so we're working back and forth in the studio. Once the top panels are completed, they're machined down to a very fine 600 mesh surface using silicon carbide, and then they're laminated onto the blocks of glass. Once that lamination process is complete, then the entire sculpture is run through a series of optical polishing machines. The work that we've been doing for the last 4 or 5 years has gotten so complicated that the new pieces often take 3 to 4 months to put together and run as high as 200 to 300 man-hours in each sculpture. The assembly process is really quite painstaking and labor-intensive. Each of the thin strips of glass need to be laminated together. We use a very high-tech resin adhesive that's about $1,500 a gallon. We have a special temperature-controlled room and vacuum pump that we use to take the soluble gases out of the resin. When's the last time In the laminating room, we have a glass table that allows us to project lights from underneath and overhead as necessary to see into the piece as it's being laminated. That is a double insurance that we don't have any bubbles or anything trapped in between the layers of the resin. The laminating process takes about 2 days before we can go back in and recut or do any additional work on the top panel that we're working on. The Huchthausen resin cures in about 7 days at 70 degrees. And what we do is we speed up the cure to about 30 hours by preheating it to about 106 degrees and then maintaining a constant temperature within the laminating room. The lens cuts are produced using a series of diamond impregnated metal wheels. This is a similar process to cutting and polishing the blocks of glass that are used in the sculptures themselves. The piece is held up against the rotating diamond wheel, fed with water to cool it, and the lenses are simply cut, moving down through a different gradation of diamonds, and then finally polished out. This is a very arduous process, very difficult, because the sculptures by this point are often weigh as much as 60 to 80 pounds. So it's a very strenuous technical process. After the color panels have been laminated onto the sculptures, each of the surfaces of the piece needs to be machined down very precisely. This involves protecting all of the surfaces using a rubberized resist material and numerous layers of duct tape. During this process, the piece takes on an ugly duckling sort of a look. You lose all of the glass-like quality and really don't know what you're looking at since you don't have any ability to look through the resist material. Only one surface of the piece is exposed at any one given time, and it's run through a whole series of optical polishing machines, again using various slurries of silicon carbide, machining the piece down to a very smooth chalkboard-like surface that's a result of the 600 mesh silicon carbide machine. From that point, the pieces are optically polished. This is again on the reciprolap machines, but using either hard Spanish felt fed with a slurry of cerium oxide and water, or we also use textured nylon pads, again with cerium oxide and water. And this produces this very clean, precise, optically polished surface on the finished sculpture. What's personally really exciting for me is when I get to that stage where the final surface has been polished and I get to take all of the duct tape and the resist and all the protective layers off of the piece and really see the thing finished for the first time. The excitement is enhanced by the fact that very often these pieces have been in progress for 2 to 3 months, and I've only conceptualized how they're going to look. I think I know how they're going to look, but I'm very often surprised because sometimes things will turn up or be created within the sculpture that I didn't anticipate. So it's a very exciting thing for me to see that final piece after it's removed from the polish and cleaned up. I've always been incredibly concerned about using the whole 360-degree circumference of the piece. I'm really interested in having the viewer move around the piece. So much work that you see has one good view or maybe 2 good views. What I'm trying to do is to really create something that's fully volumetric, that really engages the viewer and forces the viewer to move around it. Things change and mutate within the piece as the viewer moves. So in some ways it's, one person referred to them as large kaleidoscopes, but the viewer moves instead of the kaleidoscope. You have all of this optical actions and interactions that go on the insides of the sculpture. Some of that's refracted light, some of it's reflected light, but it changes because of the angles that are cut into it as the viewer moves, and dependent, of course, on the light source. So you have a piece that's constantly in visual motion. They're not static pieces. No matter what angle you look at it from, if you move 5 or 6 inches one way or another, you're going to really have a very radically different view of that piece. It's been interesting to me to read or listen to what the critics or the reviewers have to say about the work. Normally I don't pay a lot of attention to it, but one comment that I really found intriguing a number of years ago, one writer referred to the sculpture as high-tech spiritual, and it really made me think a lot about it, because it does kind of sum up a lot of what's going on in this work. You have this very hard-edged geometry, or this skin on the outside with the color panels, and then this very ghost-like, ethereal light projections and illusions on the interior sections of the space. So it's really almost like creating a fourth dimension inside of this shell. My work has always been deliberately enigmatic. It's always been mysterious. I've been leery of providing too much information or telling a viewer exactly what he should or shouldn't be seeing in the work. I've tried to let the sculpture speak for itself. I obviously make a lot of references to different things. There's obviously architectural references, there's spatial relationships, there's historic references that go beyond just the types of glass that I use. But I'm really challenging the viewer to find his or her way into the sculpture. To me, that's where the real strength of it lies.